Hello, welcome to the 10th podcast in our series on vaccine hesitancy. I'm Tom Sorrell. I'm a professor at the University of Warwick in the UK. Today, we're going to be talking about vaccine misinformation. My guest is Daniel Jolly from the University of Nottingham. Daniel, will you introduce yourself, please?
I'm Dr. Daniel Jolly. I'm an assistant professor based at the University of Nottingham. Now, I'm a social psychologist, so that means I'm interested in how we gain our beliefs and how others impact us. And for the last 10 years or so, I've been interested in the psychology of conspiracy theories and broadly misinformation. So very much thinking about why do so many people believe in conspiracy theories? What is their potential harm on the individual and society? And also thinking about, okay, if they are harmful, how do we reduce their negative effects?
So, Daniel, in previous episodes of this podcast, we've heard from some experts on conspiracy theories in general and on the presence of conspiracy theories in online spaces. They were interested in, these previous experts were interested in the whole range of conspiracy theories, not necessarily just those to do with vaccines. But maybe could you tell us a bit about what distinguishes, um, vaccine conspiracy theories from, say, QAnon conspiracy theories or other famous, more political uh, conspiracy theories?
I think about them as from the same kind of pool of sea, shall we say, in the sense that they all have the kind of key ingredients of what makes a conspiracy theory. And what we argue, and some of my colleagues, is that a conspiracy theory has the actor, an action, and a motive. And it's the interaction between these different ingredients that can make a conspiracy theory seem plausible or just totally just deranged. So when I think about anti-vaccine conspiracies versus, let's say, climate change or conspiracy theories about Jewish people or immigrants, they all kind of have that same kind of rhetoric as part of it. It's that powerful group doing something sinister, typically plots and schemes for their own hidden agenda, typically something self-interest. So when I think about changing the actor, the protagonist, from a Jewish person to a doctor to the government, it kind of feels that it feels very, very familiar. So I always sometimes think about it as, is it the consequence that is slightly different? That when we think about anti-vaccine conspiracy theories, they're a very strong predictor of anti-vaccine vaccine uptake. Similarly, when you think about Jewish conspiracy theories, they're a strong predictor of negativity, of prejudice towards Jewish people and indeed other ethnic groups. So instead, I wonder, is it not necessarily about the conspiracy itself? Because, of course, it has that kind of crux of what a conspiracy is, again, from that C that I mentioned. Is it more just the implications of that conspiracy? Now, that's not me saying for certain that anti vaccine conspiracies don't predict other consequences. I'm sure they probably do. That's probably because they kind of these conspiracies often hang together around the notions that conspiracies exist in our world, and that someone's very particular on edge about that. But I certainly can imagine that anti-vaccine links with vaccine uptake, and climate science links with anti-climate science conspiracy theories. So that's
Yeah.
how I kind of see the two nuances, I suppose.
Well, just to follow the model that you're talking about, if one needs to find or typically finds a powerful protagonist or maybe an anti-hero, maybe a villain, would the villain in the case of anti-vaccine conspiracy theories often be a big pharma company or possibly a government?
Yes, definitely. And it actually also makes me think about COVID-19 conspiracy theories and how that example also brought in 5G and kind of scientists and engineers and a whole host of other groups that could be involved in that. Which I suppose is that one nuance of between anti-vaccine conspiracies and conspiracies about medical issues in general to do, for example, with COVID. So yes, with regards to vaccines, though, typically is the pharmaceuticals. Sometimes it is doctors and nurses, where people on the front line are seen to be part of the conspiracy. In particular, this was very evident through COVID-19, where rhetoric was around, people should be hanged, and the Nuremberg trials, what they do into the population kind of rhetoric, which of course was against the doctors and nurses on that front line.
We know that there have been conspiracy theories about vaccines for a long time before COVID, and that's one of the things I wanted to ask you to comment on. We know that a long time ago, even in the 1990s, that there was a systematic stirring up of fear about the MMR vaccine, the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, and that the article in the journal literature that inspired that,
Mm.
the Lancet article that inspired that, was subsequently disowned by the Lancet, and the anti-MMR article was discredited, but it
Mm.
still has a following even now
Mm.
among people who are still opposed to the MMR
Mm.
vaccine completely independently of COVID. But I mean, could you talk about the relationship between those two kinds of conspiracy theory um, applications, the MMR on the one hand and COVID-19
Mm.
on the other?
So, of course, with vaccine conspiracy theories, they land on kind of a fertile ground potentially, where people are maybe feeling fearful. They're looking for answers, trying to make a decision that definitely, if it comes to do with their children, is a decision that people take very seriously. So, being on the one hand, being exposed to conspiratorial rhetoric that paints, the vaccine as something that we should be scared of because it's got something in it that the government is hiding. That can be a particularly kind of a point that kind of sticks in our mind where we think, okay, if there's any concern with this, I want to kind of pull back on that. And some work the early work that I did had looked into the role of being exposed to this sort of content and vaccine intentions with parents. And indeed, we demonstrated that belief in and exposure to this kind of content can impact vaccine intentions. And of course, this study has then been kind of replicated definitely in the COVID era with regards to the link between COVID-19 beliefs and vaccine uptake. That relationship is often seen to be small but very robust. And researchers who did a meta-analysis highlighted that although the effect is small, at the population level, it is quite large and indeed can impact health behaviours. Although I think it's also worth thinking about the other side of the coin, in the sense that some new research has come out to highlight how across a longitudinal study, so a bit of work that looked at multiple time points across a series of time, they found kind of that conspiracy beliefs did predict vaccine uptake, but they also found that vaccine uptake also predicted conspiracy beliefs. And they found actually in one study that was actually stronger than the alternative. So what that suggests, therefore, is that some people who do not want to vaccinate, maybe it's because they feel fearful or they have a gut response or something happens, they don't want to vaccinate, and they look for reasons or rationales for why they don't want to do their behavior. And that therefore can make a conspiracy theory seem appealing. So in that moment when they've decided they don't want to vaccinate, maybe because they feel that gut feeling of fear, they try to rationalize and make sense of that gut feeling, which therefore could mean that they believe in conspiracy theories. Potentially they may believe in anything in the sense that misinformation they may hold on to because it's justifying their behavior. Now, for me, I think it is, and as the authors argue as well, actually, that it is bidirectional. So I think it depends on the context and the person. What I mean by that is I can imagine situations where if someone is exposed to this content, definitely thinking back to the 1990s, we're exposed to the content, that is going to increase fears and powerlessness, which will make you more worrisome about vaccinating. But
Yeah.
similarly, someone who decides they don't want to vaccinate for whatever reason, may use a conspiracy belief as a way to justify what they are doing.
Mm.
So potentially, there's different kind of groups of people who have different potential journeys to believing in conspiracy theories. It's kind of jumping the gun potentially, but it's also thinking when you come to interventions, how you target that in the sense that if someone is not vaccinating because of their belief, or maybe focusing on their belief is really important, their worldview. If someone is not vaccinating because they're fearful or because it's the behavioral element and they're using the conspiracy belief as a way to justify that behavior, maybe focusing on the behavior is what is really important for them. So maybe making it more easier for them to come into the doctors, thinking about strategies around how you turn the intention into behavior, etc., etc. But so for me, I think it's super interesting how the link exists and this nuanced research is highlighting, well, actually, it could be a way to kind of fill the gap when someone doesn't want to vaccinate, which
Yes.
I think certainly makes sense. And as I say, I think it's bi-directional.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're saying what seems very plausible, that if independently of everything else, one is vaccine skeptical, say one's skeptical about the MMR vaccine, that might predispose you to accept other conspiracy theories that have nothing to do with one's health, and you may be attracted to them. Um, in the
Good,
world,
actually, good question. I think that actually is an empirical question because we don't know
yes,
that.
yes,
We
oh,
know
indeed,
that the vaccine behavior makes you more conspiratorial to anti-vaccine conspiracy beliefs. But I do wonder, and I do theorize that once that person then starts believing in that anti-vaccine conspiracy, I'm sure it's probably a gateway into believing in other types of
yeah,
conspiracy theories.
yeah,
Because we know that they're really impactful and they can impact our beliefs and our behaviors. So I can certainly imagine that journey happening where that person kind of comes down, in essence, that conspiratorial rabbit hole where it leads to other things.
yeah,
But just to highlight that, at least currently, that's empirical. We don't know if that actually
right,
is the case,
yeah,
but I feel that it would be from what we know about how
it's
these
plausible.
beliefs link and find and etc.
It's plausible. Um, we were we've learned from other podcasts we've done and other research that we've done that uh, there were lots of respects in which COVID-19 uh, might differ from the earlier MMR um, vaccine hesitancy or vaccine skepticism. Um, One way in which it seems to differ is that it's not it's not typically strongly to do with people's children, since the people who were
Mm.
most vulnerable were not in that age group, and there was even some suggestion that children weren't very vulnerable to it. So what seemed to be highlighted, especially in America, but even to some extent in the UK, was this idea that COVID 19 was a kind of pretext for a general power grab on the part of a government, that these lockdowns and other restrictions on people's liberty actually served the interests of the government in trying to to foster a more passive, accepting, obedient type of citizenry. And there seems to be some variation because in America, there's a general background belief that government's a bad thing and that it always carries the risk of tyranny, whereas in the UK that isn't believed so much. But I mean, does that come out in your research that there's this idea of a pretext for a government seizure of power that may help to distinguish COVID-19 from the MMR, which doesn't have so many of these implications?
Mm. I like the term you mentioned there, the power grab. And not really thought about it like that. It's super, super interesting how, of course, the context really does matter. But when you were talking, I was also thinking how with COVID-19, it impacted everyone. It was one of those issues that was very inclusive in a way. Everyone got really involved in it. And I think back to other types of conspiracy theories and health issues, like with Zika, and how that impacted only certain people, really, so
Mm.
geography at least. Whereas with the COVID, it kind of came kind of universal across. And then also, it there came at that time when I suppose people were already a little bit skeptical about kind of issues in society, and trust, of course, was playing a key role. So I wonder if it just came at that perfect, fertile time where the perception of being suspicious, and yes, very nicely the paragraph, climate change, metric, and QAnon before, like it kind of came at a time when people were kind of open to that. And then I wonder if because it's so universal, that's why we saw these beliefs go across, lines across the world. Whereas think about other types of conspiracies, which are a bit more centered on geography, or rather they impact only certain people in that community, or should we say, that's where it kind of bubbles around. So I'm only thinking here was back with MNR, was it just because it was a very centralized issue? Was it something to do with the context around that particular issue that therefore made it very specific? So I wonder if that happened, let's say next week, would we find the same kind of spin around COVID as we have done if the MRR came around next week with the whole conspiracy theories? I feel it seems like a different place. It feels like a very different
Yes.
bubble that we're in currently. So I would imagine there would be differences, and of
Yes.
course also how widespread that is as well. Because of course, when I talk about the communities, often the conspiracies arise around big events and issues in society, but those issues and events can be specific to a particular community or group, or indeed even at the individual level, whereby you find that event in your life to be really traumatic, and you there try to explain that event in different ways. And believing in a conspiracy can offer an answer to whatever that has happened, which indeed can also be on the individual, but never mind the kind of community level. So in a way, I was thinking how these events impact different communities. And with COVID, it impacted us all. It was very inclusive, as I say. I wonder, is that the difference between the two for
Well,
me?
yes, yes. I mean, that certainly seems to be part of the difference. But if we could just develop this a little bit. So, if one looks at some of the things that were said at the time um, of the original worry that
Mm,
MMR caused, um, uh, various kinds of disorders in
mm,
children, and also bowel disorders. At
mm,
at the time at which this was being mooted,
mm,
um, a lot of people who seemed to be particularly worried were people who already were interested in alternative medicine. So they already thought that that they were quite expert, or
mm,
had much more autonomy about health decisions, or ought to have much more autonomy about health decisions
mm,
than the medical establishment wanted them to have.
mm,
Um, and so, you know, the use of complementary medicine and so on was, in a
mm,
way, um, an attempt to expand their autonomy,
mm,
and basically to show that there was a different way of handling one's well-being from
mm,
conventional medicine. That seems to be, um, you know, a world away from
mm,
people who are necessarily trying to find some malicious force um, behind things that they have to encounter. It's more a positive, if you like. I wonder what you think about this.
mm,
People are sort of saying, how should I lead my life? Should I be at the mercy of medical experts, or should I listen to my body? Isn't natural isn't a sort of natural remedy better than a pharmaceutical remedy? Um, all this sort of new age thinking,
mm,
which seems a world away from the
mm,
Trumpists and QAnon and
mm,
some world conspiracy
mm,
that COVID is sort of promoting or serving or something. Um,
mm,
what's your view about this kind of new age aspect of the previous sort of skepticism?
mm. So I was just trying to think about how what the consensus was around that, in the
Mm,
sense that were there some people who were believing that, and were there some people who were a bit more sinister with it? Because if you think, I suppose, you think about COVID, you do get a whole range of different people involved. And actually, you can get a whole range of different conspirators and different ways to understand what is happening for the same thing.
Yeah.
So when I think about MMR, I'm proposing, was there differences in rhetoric, and does it depend on the community level and the individual, and a bit about the psychology for why they are drawn into, whether it's trying to understand how they should live their life versus this is kind of sinister element and they're kind of out to get us. I
Mm.
suppose, is it all based around trying to understand and make sense of their life? I suppose, is that kind of the bow that brings it all together? And also, I wonder, is the differences in just how we discuss this content now? So, of course, the online world has changed things and how we talk about and how we think about these things. So, could it be that the norms have changed around it, in the sense of the perceived norm, in that these things are more widely spread than they are, maybe? I mean, we
Mhm.
obviously know that they are reasonably
Mhm.
spread, but like, even often people kind of overestimate how much people believe in conspiracies, and in particular to do with anti-vaccine conspiracies. So I wonder, is that also that is different, and how that maybe have changed the rhetoric to feel more sinister, because you think, well, actually, these beliefs or these ideas are actually quite widespread. I feel that a lot of people in my community are asking the same questions I am.
Mm.
Has that helped the shift for some people from how to live one's life to actually how to, well, how they're trying to stop me living my life? And these are those kind of reflections, ideas, kind of on the spot in a way, to try and think about, I suppose, the differences also, again, between what happened a few years ago and now. I always think with social media, it's an interesting kind of link between these concepts.
Yeah.
But I don't necessarily think that we're in the age of conspiracy theories, in the sense that social media has made them more popular and they're more and has created them. Rather, I imagine those who are already predisposed, i.e., back in the 1990s, will probably find them today as well. But I was wondering if that perception that they're more widespread, the perception that people can make the communities online and kind of talk to each other and actually have dialogue, make them feel the more, I suppose, more widespread, more accessible, which is slightly different to what you're asking, which was about, of course, the differences in the people versus the new age, i.e., how to live one's life versus, well, actually, is it all sinister? And I wonder if is it linked by that desire to understand what's happening, the desire to kind of make sense of, I suppose, one's chaotic life. In a
Yeah.
way.
Yeah. Well, in some work that I did at the time, or much earlier than COVID, um, uh, there seemed to, I suggested that there was a kind of convergence between a sort of political agenda that was being pursued in the UK, where patients were being told that their choices were not so much sacrosanct, but that patient choice was an important value, and patient autonomy and patient decisions about their health were extremely important. That that was a sort of background uh, to what might have encouraged um, a certain kind of vaccine hesitancy, combined with the idea that parents are authoritative about what happens to their children. Another thing that was encouraged at around the same time, that
Mm,
parental choice and
mm,
patient choice, those
mm,
those two kinds of mantra
mm.
might have combined. That's
And that's very interesting, because I always think about how having a choice and autonomy and being listened to is empowering. And actually, when you feel empowered, it's been shown that you're less likely to believe in conspiracy theories.
but
So
it,
it is very interesting, your reflection and your
yeah,
work,
yeah.
highlighting how feeling empowered, i.e., having a voice in making a decision, actually brought some people down the conspiratorial path. When we would imagine actually being empowered should make you feel that actually people aren't out to get you, and that you're more open to thinking through different ideas. So actually, that
But it,
is super interesting, because often I think about giving people a voice and, in essence, principles around procedural justice as a way to think about reducing conspiracy beliefs, so having a voice in the workplace, having a voice in society in general, being listened to. When in actual fact, maybe having a voice could actually backfire in a way. So indeed, it makes you think about the psychology of what, when someone had the autonomy to think about whatever they wanted, they were drawn to this kind of sinister, kind of entertainment value in a way, kind of area. It's
well,
interesting.
yeah. or it may be that there are kinds of choice and kinds of apparent promotion of autonomy that are really at bottom consumerist. So
Mm.
it's not that people are being told to take control of their lives. It's rather that they're being reminded that the customer is always right. I think that was part of what's going on with the patient choice agenda. That that the NHS should have worked in the old days, at the time the MMR skepticism came up, that the patient was always right. And that idea might have emboldened people to think, well, if I feel strongly that this is against my well-being, then who is to trump my opinion? Um, that could have been a coincidence of views that encouraged
Mm. So
this
interesting.
without being empowering, perhaps.
Mm.
So, I mean, one of the things that I think you've worked on, and some of your colleagues have also worked on, is the idea of how you um, loosen the hold of conspiracy theories, vaccine conspiracy theories in particular. Maybe we could talk about that a little bit. I think that in one paper that you co-authored with other people, um, there was the thought that to engage with conspiracy theories and lessen their influence, it was important to have lessons or courses in critical thinking. Is that is that still what you think? And is there evidence?
So on the big scheme of things, yes, in the sense of telling people or letting people learn how to spot shoddy evidence in a way, so that people can have the questions that I think is really important that we have, and we ask questions about all different things, but we understand how to, I suppose, get the answers to those questions. And you'll just be aware of bias in the writing, the bias in different sources, looking for consensus, how important consensus is. So very much around trying to spot that shoddy evidence. And indeed, a study recently looked at different interventions, and they found that kind of critical thinking, kind of thinking through the evidence, kind of analytical thinking was kind of the best intervention out there, the ones that have been developed. But I also take a bit of a critical view on it, in a sense that that obviously comes with the assumption that if we just tell people kind of how to ask these questions, that then that's all well and good. Which I do agree with in the one hand, but of course it's very, very complicated. People digest content from a whole range of different perspectives. Indeed, one perspective, for example, in some of my other work, has highlighted that if you're a victim, so it could be to do with being discriminated against because of your sexuality or your race, or indeed you've been a victim of bullying, this can make you slightly more conspiratorial. So actually, the journey to you make to being seen to be conspiratorial is actually you having your life experience where you have been the subject to arguably a type of conspiracy, which therefore means that you evaluate the world around you in this conspiratorial lens.
Mm-hmm.
So if I were to tell someone who's been bullied or indeed who has been, discriminated against because of their sexuality, oh, just think more clearly, just evaluate the evidence, I suspect the answer will be, well, I am. And I am looking at my life experience. So actually, I think there's more of a discussion around how we think about one's collective reality, I suppose, and their lived experience, and how that can kind of move into what the actual reality is in that current climate. So is it around building trust? Is it around how the person perceives themselves and indeed some of their own psychology? So is it around that person's feelings of anxiety, of threat as an individual level, which indeed could be coupled with that critical thinking skills around, okay, now you kind of got your emotions under check and you understand your experience and you're kind of building trust again with our institutions. This is also how you can evaluate knowledge. This is also how you can spot that shoddy evidence. So that potentially when you come into it with your lens and your life lens, you're able to think, okay, this is how I digest that content. So I totally think the principles around here's how to spot shoddy evidence is really important. But I think that won't work for everyone. It will be
Yeah.
some individuals who are on that journey because of actual conspiracies will have to have a slightly different kind of take on that. And potentially that intervention is just one type of intervention for that kind of community. If that makes
Yes.
sense.
I mean, one of the things that struck me about listening to people who are conspiracy minded is that they regard themselves as critical, as open minded, as not being sucked into a kind of herd way of
Mm,
thinking.
mm,
They perhaps run together thinking differently from thinking critically.
mm,
Um,
mm,
but it looks
mm,
as if one simply said, think critically, some conspiracy theorists could say, I already do. That's why
mm,
I believe that there are conspiracies. Um,
mm. And
that
it's super interesting. The paper highlighted how, as you mentioned, the perception that they are being a critical thinker is foremounted. But when they do some tasks that objectively are critical thinking,
Yeah,
they actually don't perform well on them. So is that misperception that you think you're being a critical thinker when in actual fact you are not?
yes,
And indeed, as you say, just telling them, well, think critically, they'll be
right,
like, what?
right. Well,
And that's based on that kind of misperception. Never mind if that's based in someone's experience or like, well, it's complicated. So I
yeah.
think it's one kind of part of the bow, as it were.
We've encountered in some of the psychological literature a guy called Matthew Hornsey, um, who has the jujitsu theory of how to respond to conspiracy theories. And I guess you can correct me if I'm wrong. The I guess the idea of the jujitsu theory is that you take these tendencies that conspiracy minded people have to sort of look behind the appearances, look for that powerful protagonist or antagonist, find motivations for certain things being recommended to one, and one turns that against the conspiracy minded themselves. One says, what deep interests are they serving? What malicious purposes might they be pursuing? And that might be a way of countering conspiracy theory, um, using, so to speak, their own tools or
Mm,
tendencies against
mm,
them. What do you think
mm.
about that?
Super interesting. And I think if you're able to get someone to really step back and look at both sides of the coin, that's kind of your ideal kind of skeptic. But I suppose I can imagine someone who their identity is part of this conspiracy community, well, what community, wherever it is, climate change, vaccine, but they're probably going to be pretty resistant to being open to think about their community in this very negative way. There's going to have to be some kind of event that happens that kind of pulls them out of it. And makes me think about some of the examples of QAnon where I've done the specifics, but so it's meant to have happened on a certain date, and that never actually happened. And then for some people, that was kind of a moment of
Mm,
reflection to
mm,
go, what?
mm,
And I bet in that moment, to have that sort of intervention where you say, well, actually, look, this is actually what that movement is about, and here's some kind of critical reflections on that movement. I bet in that moment they'll probably be quite open to it because they're suddenly re-evaluating it for themselves. But I suppose if you've gone to someone on a normal Monday morning and kind of given this information, it may not have even touched the surface. So I wonder, I like the idea, but I wonder how we kind of get the conversation started and have someone, I suppose, open to ask those questions. So actually, I wonder, is it around the conversations around kind of and the tools around critical thinking in the sense of, well, how do you think critically about your beliefs? How
mm,
do you digest information?
mm,
And don't use examples that are about that better passive identity or that belief, but rather talk about things that are kind of safe. And in a way, get people to start using some of the rhetoric around asking questions and looking towards bias in all areas of an argument. And maybe that kind of subtle conversation prompts that kind of appreciation that you're both asking questions, that you both want to find answers, may encourage someone to kind of do that kind of journey themselves without someone going, look, here's all the reasons why I think this is bad. I mean, is that a bit more of a productive way of doing it? That's also kind of still around the same principles.
mm, mm. Yeah, yeah, I see that. I mean, just to go back to the point about QAnon that you were mentioning before, I think there were various dates that were regarded as very important in the QAnon community
Mm,
in relation to when Donald Trump would take action after the
mm,
election. and actually put in prison some of the people who were involved in the deep state, the so-called deep state in America. And when these didn't happen, they sort of almost snapped out of it. And another kind of prompt for thinking again was the fact that many people who were called by Donald Trump to participate in the events of January 2021 um, uh, were put in prison, whereas Trump wasn't. I think that that kind of thing caused some second thoughts on the part of some people who'd been very enthusiastically Trumpist before January the 6th. That isn't exactly the jujitsu theory, but perhaps, as you pointed out just now, that would be another sort of point of leverage against
Well,
this.
of course, those examples feel quite unique.
Mm,
Often with a conspiracy belief, there's not like an endpoint. There's not a point where someone goes, "Ha!" Like it seems to be very specific to QAnon. I mean, another example I can think of is around false flags and how one individual whose child was murdered in Sandy Hook, he said actually at the start he would class himself as a conspiracy theorist. He believed in 9/11, etc. And then actually when he became part of a conspiracy and other people were saying to him his child didn't exist, that was a moment for him that he thought, huh, this actually is I'm part of the conspiracy. This is not true. Which for me again is another really unique example of that happening. So when you think about anti-vaccine, when is that switch? Like when is that moment? It's really difficult to pinpoint. Climate change, difficult to pinpoint.
yes.
Is it people experiencing the effects of climate change like recently? Is that a moment that people kind of go, huh, actually, is something going on here? So I think the Sandy Hook and indeed QAnon are very unique examples of having that nice moment to go, huh, that's that click. Um,
Well,
yeah.
certainly in the case of COVID, again to allude to another uh, series that Mariana Spring did on BBC to do with conspiracy theories. She gave the example of someone who was a COVID skeptic who suddenly fell ill with COVID, and upon falling ill, suddenly saw the light, but died before he could get to hospital. So, I mean, that could be another example
Quite
of,
extreme, isn't it?
yeah, it is. It is, but I mean, it's another example of these kinds of episodes. They're kinds of epiphanies in a way, where
Mm,
where
mm,
where people are brought to their senses, and
mm,
I don't, as you say, it's kind of difficult to
mm.
give a method for creating epiphanies. Maybe they wouldn't be epiphanies if there were.
If suddenly we can say, "Ha ha! Here's one at the box."
Exactly. Okay, Daniel. Well, we've probably reached the end of our time. Thank you very much for sharing your your understanding of some of these conspiracy theory ideas with us.
Pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.